So who wants to go first?
Not me. This on?
Okay, it's a simple question. We'll start, we'll take it easy in the beginning. So, I mean, they've given us a topic. It's about a foreigner's perspective about India. And I just wanted to say that, we Indians are extremely sensitive people, given to outraging easily. And unfortunately, we have a history of killing each other over stories, So I was just wondering what prompted you to, choose this particular subject to write about, It's a sensitive thing. And I don't know, just tell us how you chose this particular...
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us here. It's a very great pleasure. And you talk about countries with a history of killing each other. We have a long history of that in the UK, and a lot of the period which is covered by our Mughal dynasty. Europe was awash with extremely destructive wars, often across a religious divide. But I think what attracted us to writing about the Mughals, we were brought in perhaps slightly at a tangent, because we wrote a non-fiction book about the Taj Mahal, which, like a lot of foreigners, when we first came to India, we were very young, we just got married, we thought we have to go and see the Taj. Absolutely captivated us. Wasn't till at least 20 years later we decided to write a book about how it had come to be. And we realized that to understand that building, we had to go very far back in Indian history, the history of Hindustan, and indeed beyond into the history of Central Asia. And that led us to read all the Mughal chronicles, and to then start to develop the series forward again. So it was really that particular iconic building that was our entry point into writing about the Mughals.
Okay, thank you, Diana. The Mughals, at least, I mean, they're very, very famous. A lot of people associate Indian history solely with the Mughals. Whereas Andrew here, he's gone and picked a really, really obscure character. He's like, I'd never heard of him before, honestly. So I was just wondering, where the hell did this chap find this character, and how come he devoted so much of his life, towards researching him and creating this labor of love?
Life has strange twists and turns, and I had a very strange twist when I was in college. I was in the basement of my university library, and there were these memoirs for Hickey's lawyer, and I was opening the book, and it was a fascinating story. Now I've read through about this wild Irishman, this lower-class man who founded India's first newspaper, opened a printing press in a jail cell in Calcutta, and I put it away for a while. And I wasn't a student of Indian history. In fact, if you had asked me what I was going to do with my life 8-9 years ago, this would have been the last thing I would have told you. So I found this book and I put it away, and I came back 6 months later. And I think many things in life, money is a good motivating factor. And I got money to do research, which was really actually made this happen. And then as I got deeper and deeper in the research, and I sort of realized that, I think I was a really good person to write this book, because the main character of my book is an outsider to India himself. He's sort of a lower class fellow. I come from sort of a middle class background in the United States. I'm an outsider as well, and I thought I had a unique perspective of telling this book, and I really, I think it was an important story to tell, and I fell in love with that story. And 5 or 6 years later, everything sort of fell in line, and the book was published, and here I am now.
And another thing, this question is for both of you. As someone who writes in history also, I can't help but notice that most people seem to think that history is set in stone. I was just talking to Michael, and he was saying he has readers who come and argue with him, those who are history buffs mainly, and they come and say, you didn't mention that he had brown eyes. I know that. People feel like they know their historical characters. In India, we feel that way about our gods and goddesses too. And people feel, okay, this is the gospel truth, this is exactly what happened thousands of years ago, and you've taken liberties with it, but those of us who actually research history, we find that there's so much contradiction. We can spend a lifetime doing research, and you're still not going to arrive at a coherent narrative. So I wanted to ask you where history ends and where the fiction begins. Whether we notice there are holes in the narrative, we plug it using either our imagination or probably educated guesses. So I wanted to know how you handle the fact that there's so much contradiction, so many differing opinions. In fact, people would say that history is an inaccurate record of improbable events written by people who weren't actually there. I mean, you've written non-fiction, and they've done non-fiction as well as fiction. So how can we tell the difference?
History probably begins 2 minutes after it happens, because if we asked any of the audience what one of us said about 2 minutes ago, would get 5 or 10 different versions. Being a bit more serious, when you look at the sources for historical events, and here we'll just stick to some of the European history we've done, like the major conference at Yalta in 1945 about the end of the Second World War, you see that the memoirs all said the person who wrote them had a major influence on what happened. In their diaries, they explain sometimes when they've been accused of a mistake that wasn't what they meant. They comment on their fellows' behavior in a much more acidic fashion than they do on their own. History, memoirs, diaries are always written, well, not always, but often written in a way of self-justification, self-exculpation. You can never ever believe that every single word of anything you read is true unless you have an actual taped transcript of what went on. And if it's a taped transcript, you can't see the expression on the people's face.
Yes, and I'll just add, I don't know if anybody else here is familiar with this book, but when I was at school a long time ago, we were brought up on a book by E.H. Carr, wasn't it called What is History? And you read that and it makes you think you can't actually believe anything. What is an historical fact? How can you know? How can you tell? And to go back to your question, one of the things that we try to do, both with our fiction and our non-fiction, where we think there are gaps or ambiguities or quite often conflicting accounts of a certain event, is to try and amass as much material as you can from as wide a range of sources as you can. And then you hope that somehow you develop a kind of antennae that will lead you through all of this information to try and discern something which you think and you hope is close to the truth. But I think you have to say quite honestly that you can never be, in most cases, quite sure.
If I might add to that as well, I think a lot of our process is judging the credibility of our sources, and some are more truthful than others, and everyone has their own bias. But I think just as important is that when you do research and the process of it, you often start with the secondary source material, and not only is there bias in the original primary sources that we read, but there's bias in the writers 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and we ourselves have our own biases. And I did my best to be objective and write in a fair and honest manner and let the reader decide. But nonetheless, I think it's all of our responsibilities to sort of read through a book and get an understanding of who the author is, not just who the source is, and get a sense of their credibility as well.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, this one is for the two of you actually. As the Instagrammers would say, you guys set couple goals, because you all not only live together, you'll work together. And I was telling my husband, my God, I have no idea how they do it. Because I think one reason we don't kill each other on any given day is because we don't work together, we give each other that space. And I was thinking, and I remember, Diana, you'd said that there's a certain synergy when you guys work together. It's a very organic process, even if, you'll decide who's going to handle which chapter, stuff like that. But please tell me you have disagreements before I get really depressed and excessively jealous. Just tell me there are disagreements, and please tell me how do you handle it when he says, no, I don't want to do research anymore. I want to go for a walk in the park. I want to eat and go to sleep. I don't want to work anymore, Diana. Just leave me alone. And you're like, no. Or it could be the other way around. He wants to work and you just want to sleep. What happens then?
You got it the right way around.
Yes. Now, so here's a question. Which one of us will answer that? So we've been married a very long time, so we know each other very well. In terms of how we actually managed to write together, perhaps one bit of the salvation is that we have separate studies in different bits of the house. So we will disappear for a morning or an afternoon, and we'll go off and perhaps be doing completely different things. One of us might be doing some research, one of us might be doing a bit of writing. But then, of course, there comes a stage where everything has to be discussed and woven together, and I'd be telling an absolute lie if I didn't say we didn't have arguments or quite robust discussions. We sometimes find we see things quite differently. I'll just give one example. There was one afternoon I spent time on my own. I think it was the novel about Humayun, if I remember correctly. And I'd done 3 paragraphs, and at the end of the afternoon, I was quite pleased with them. And Mike came along and said, how have you been getting on? And he leant over my shoulder, and he looked at the screen, and he said after a bit, yeah, I can see what you've done. He said, that's really quite remarkable. He said, 3 paragraphs, and you've managed a cliche in every single one. So we had a discussion about how that needed to be rewritten. But on the whole, I think by discussion, debate, we managed to resolve most things, but we also have help from outsiders. We have a very good agent, a literary agent, have very good editors, and they give us their perspective. If we get stuck, we can go to a third party.
Okay, that's a relief. I think we're very happy to know that, there are and if anyone looks over my shoulder in my family when I'm working, they know they're in a world of trouble. Only my youngest will take that risk when I'm working to come and look. She'll do that and then she'll run away because I hate that. So authors are a finicky breed, I guess. And Andrew, for you, I mean, you're a journalist as well, and you mentioned that you try to you have a reporter's eye when you tell your stories. And I think one of the major themes in your book would be freedom of expression, which is like as big an issue today as it was then, unfortunately. I don't think journalists or writers can write as they please, say as they please. So, I mean, how do you go about it? Are you like going to just say, I'm going to have a devil-may-care attitude, I'm going to put on whatever the hell I feel like? Or are you a little bit more cautious because, you may get lynched?
Well, I'm leaving in a couple days, so I think I'm safe. But no. In a serious note, I don't censor what I say, and I think that's really important.
I don't believe you.
You don't? Well, I don't give a damn.
Okay, now I believe you.
Okay. But, I mean, we could talk about sort of the political aspects of journalism in India in general, and the issues there are today, and the threats against journalists, and carrying out their jobs on a day-to-day basis. And frankly, I'm kind of shielded from that. I write about history, and the people who would possibly care about what I'm writing about, they're long dead. I don't really have to worry about an encounter or any type of... No, and seriously though, I have this freedom because I write about history in India, and in the United States, I don't really have the same worries and the same threats. So I haven't come in a place where I really need to censor my writing. Of course, I think one of the main tales in my book is that Hickey is someone who really got in trouble because I think he stepped a little bit too far. He wrote things he probably shouldn't have written, such as talking about Warren Hastings' penis. Usually it's a bad idea, don't go there. Yeah, erectile dysfunction. So, you have to be smart about what you write. But I certainly respect writers and journalists in India who are willing to speak truth to power, and I think that's something that is important, but not only 230 years ago against the East India Company, but also now when we see a lot of repression against journalists and a lot of threats.
So I think an important lesson we've all learned from your book is don't go after a man's penis, ever. It's not good for your health. And this question is for both of you, I mean all of you. Sometimes I find that if you say that you're a history buff, people give you that, okay, you're a geek or a nerd look. Because a lot of people say that who cares about things that happened in the distant past? Why go down that cobwebby corridor? What purpose does it serve? And I'm saying, no, history, there's so much you can learn from history and it's relevant today. Would you agree? What is history's relevance in today's world, according to you?
Basically, people say history repeats itself, but it never does precisely. There is always something you can take from history, but then you need to think a bit more about what's changed, and then you can apply it. Probably one of the big places where you can learn things from is in military strategies, where you can look at past behaviors, past deployments, and generals, I think, study a lot of history.
If I may add, I think one of the reasons we study history, simply because we enjoy it, right? I think there is value in the stories that we learn and what we tell. And I think this is a sort of a primordial instinct, right? You sit around the campfire, you talk with your fellow cavemen, and it's storytelling that is how humans transmit information. And I really think history is how we can look back at people in the past and realize, they are just as human as we are. They have failings like we do. They may live in a different culture in a different time, but we are not that different. And I think it's really important to look back and recognize the similarities and hopefully the growth in society since that time. But basically, and I think all of our books talk about sort of the human aspect of people in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I think we enjoyed in the writing of the Empire of the Mughal series, because even though we were starting, 5 centuries back, when you look at those stories, you see such, just as Andrew's been saying, such universal themes running through them, all the same characteristics, the same things which give us pleasure, which motivate us, which depress us, make us sad, make us happy, whereas true for the people in Babur's time or Shah Jahan's time as they are today. And when you look at back in history, you realize human nature in many ways doesn't change. We perhaps dress it up in different ways, in different cultures and different societies, because we move on and we like to think we modernize and civilize. But those universalities are still there. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating for us to look back in time, because also we want to seek reasons for how we got to where we are today, and going back to the previous question, to get perhaps some clue as to what might happen next.
One thing I think is that if we transition to a cave now, the cave women would get far more of a say than they used to have.
That's good to
and
know.
That is one important thing that's changed in history, actually.
Oh, okay.
More mammoth.
Okay, and while I'm going through your work, I noticed that all of you tend to go for a very balanced perspective, even when it comes to characters who've been historically reviled. You've got Aurangzeb. People can't make up their mind about him, such a divisive character. And yet there was this very beautiful line in your book where he was a tyrant. I don't think you can deny that. But I liked how there was a line saying that, probably the reason he turned out that way was because in his line, all the men were forced to choose between a throne and a coffin. That was such a beautiful insight into the times, because we tend to judge them harshly, in retrospect. And I thought that was a very lovely way to look at it without exonerating him entirely.
Absolutely, because when you're looking at these complex and, as you say, often controversial characters, there's always going to be light and shade. There's always got to be motivation or reasons for why things are as they are. Another thing we found in our Aurangzeb research was a letter in which he said he thought that his father had never loved him. And I think that explains a lot of things which happened during his life. But when you look at Aurangzeb, whatever you think of him on the macro level, and of course there's a horrendous catalogue, things that could be laid at his door, but you also see a deeply internally troubled and divided man, very unhappy, lonely, worried about what was going to happen next to him at the end of his life. And you try, in these difficult characters, to try and build some roundness or some perspective to try and understand them. Because if you just present absolute heroes or absolute villains, it's not true to life, and it's also very boring to read about, I think.
So basically you're looking at the man behind the monarch.
Exactly.
And it applies to your book on Robert Clive also. Again, in India, I don't think you'll find people who are going to sympathize, but I liked how, you all had kind of tried to analyze his psyche, and he had a history of depression.
Yep. He certainly had a history of depression. He fell out with everybody, whether they were his junior officers, his senior officers, his parents, the officials of the East India Company, the rulers and the people of Bengal. I would have said that if you wanted to analyze him now, you might have thought of him as manic depressive. He also had a problem with opium, and he attempted suicide when he was in near Chennai, and in the end he killed himself. He obviously had difficulties, perhaps one should say.
And it's pretty much the same in your book also. I noticed that you went in a hurry to, either, even your hero, you kind of like, as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that even Hickey may have overstepped the line. And even when it came to Warren Hastings, he did do a humane thing in, making sure that Hickey was released just before he left India. So I thought that was slightly like, it was the least he could do after everything he'd done, and it was nice that you'd research that and mention that as well.
Thank you. I don't know how humane it was, to be honest. I
could have let him rot in jail and die there.
Yeah, but Hickey was no longer a threat, so you can let go. But yeah, and I think there is some humanity there, and it's important to show the nuance of people in history, because we really do a disservice not just to them, but to you, to our readers, if we don't show these people as who they really were, and to our best of our abilities. Even the most villainous character of history, the most repressive, autocratic person is still a human being. I think it's our responsibility to represent that. And not only does it make good reading, but it's also, I think it's more educational. It helps people understand the world around them better.
And another thing is, a lot of people have this misconception that writers sit on their butts and just stare at their screens or bury their noses in books, and they just churn out their books. But when I was reading up on you guys, I realized that you guys have done a lot of grunt work. I think again, I read one of your interviews, and you all had talked about actually traveling to all the historic places which you all cover in your novels, and you mentioned that that's the way to capture the essence, the sights, the smells of the place. I think you talked about the desert and the glare or something. And Andrew also, I know that, he came and he stayed right here in Kolkata.
I lived in
years.
Highland Park down the bypass.
So that's a lot of effort. That's a big chunk of your time, a big chunk of your heart and soul that goes into your book. So could you just tell your readers here about the process of, birthing your novels?
Yes. Certainly for the Mughal series, the traveling that we did, we did it because also we enjoy traveling a lot. But it was absolutely illuminating to actually see some of the places which were described in the chronicles or Babur-Nama or whatever, to see them for yourself, which is what took us back to that little corner of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, where the Mughals originally came from. It took us to Samarkand to see the tomb of Timur, where you see the shapes and forms which actually reproduce themselves in Humayun's tomb and in the Taj Mahal. From there we went really wherever we could in the Mughals' footsteps. And when we came to India, so we went to Iran too, because so much of the influence on the Mughal court was Persian. But in India itself, we were very fortunate to have a lot of help from the Archaeological Survey of India. And just to give one quick example, when we were writing about Shah Jahan, going on campaign down to the Deccan, down to the south, always accompanied by Mumtaz, who never wanted to be separated from him, the little a forward Mughal command post at Little Palace of Burhanpur was just being renovated by the ASI, and they arranged for us to see it. But what really gave us goosebumps was that one of the archaeologists showed us a chamber overlooking the Tapti River, where some scholars in the ASI believe that Mumtaz Mahal actually died. And to actually see that and think that everything that spun out from that moment, not just in terms of the building of the Taj itself, but the whole family drama that was going to ensue from that moment. Traveling to actually see these places, feel them, makes a tremendous difference, I think, to how you can actually describe them in a book.
And I think we should also say that in terms of the Taj Mahal, it's such a fusion of styles. There were lots of places where we traveled to see Hindu architecture, like the Chatris and like the work, the more detailed filigree work. So we traveled both sides of the equation, which brought together the fusion.
So I spent most of my time doing research here, and most of my time dealing with Babus, the government bureaucrats, which are a foreign regional registration office. Very fun place to go. If you want to spend a Monday afternoon, I recommend it. High Court here, I would constantly have to negotiate for my time if I wanted to do any work. And when I first started my research, I didn't really know how things worked, and it was a learning process. I was rejected for my application to do research in the High Court's archives. And of
Probably because you don't censor yourself.
Maybe. Does anyone work in the High Court? No? You do? Okay. So you had a family that yeah.
Chair in the Calcutta University was named after my. I'm not used to this. No.
Sorry, we can continue this later.
Yeah,
during
I'll
Q&A
open the
session.
floor for questions a little later.
So it's High Court is not first and primarily an archive. It's first and primarily a court. So I am at best a distraction. Mostly I was an annoyance. And of course, no one tells you in the High Court where the archives are. Turns out there's 6 of them, not just one. So I went to all 6 of different archives, and I found invariably some man drinking his tea, reading his newspaper. So I come back another day, and eventually the work got done over months and months and months. And I saw the documents I wanted to see. And I did the same thing in the National Library, where they actually keep a collection of Hickey's Bengal Gazette in the basement. And I did the same thing in the Victoria Memorial, and also I went to Delhi, to the Supreme Court. I remember tracking down one resource which had been last seen in 1911, and the Victoria Memorial staff told me they had seen it in the Supreme Court in Delhi. So I took a train to Delhi, and I went to the Supreme Court, and they said they had burned the documents, anything before 1947. So I was like, well, shit. I came back here, and someone said, oh, no, they never were transferred to Delhi. They're here only in Calcutta, and they're at the CMC, the Calcutta Municipal Corporation. So my last day, I spent over a year in Calcutta. My last day, I went to the CMC, and I sat down, and I basically went to anyone who might be able to help me, and I said, have you seen these documents? And I had a bit of a stomach problem at the time, and after 3 hours of waiting, I said, well, fuck it. I'm not going to ever see these documents. I am done. And at a certain point, you have to stop your research and realize you've gotten enough. You've gotten what you need. Anything more is gravy. But I think the moral of the story is that persistence helps, and learning the process of how research works in this country was really one of the main lessons I learned. And I think a lot of foreign researchers have similar issues.
Okay, now that you mentioned your stomach issues, I have to ask, so when you're traveling, language is going to be a barrier, and I'm going to assume the food's also going to be an issue, because I find that a lot of Westerners crib about the levels of spice we use in Indian cuisine.
I don't think the Brits query too much about the spice. After all the surveys show that curry is now, any kind of spicy curry is now our favourite national dish, not fish and chips. But we do need to be jolly careful sometimes, and I do understand about running out of archives for reasons which will only too obvious. But yeah, one copes with that, and it's almost it's part of the fun of not at the time, but it's sometimes part of the fun of travel. I can recall travelling up the Mekong River, and I can now recount with great detail how I felt to lots of people.
I just have a funny story about the regional registration office. Should I? Yeah. This was in 2014. The World Cup was happening, and
World Cup in what?
Soccer, football.
Okay.
Football.
I thought it might
I'm
be
sorry,
cricket.
in India we know only
no.
one World Cup. We acknowledge only the Cricket World Cup.
I don't like cricket. Sorry. I also don't like baseball, so I don't discriminate. I don't discriminate.
There'll be a mob waiting for you outside. You've been warned.
Oh gosh, I should censor
I don't
myself.
like cricket either, so.
So I would go to the foreign regional registration office maybe once or twice a week. And I had picked up enough Bangla by this time, I could understand what they're talking about, and I would always show up. I'd be the only person in the office, the only foreigner. And for the first half hour, 45 minutes, they'd be talking about the games, the matches, Germany versus Spain, France versus England, whatever. And I'm like, are you going to start working? It's 11 o'clock, come on, I have to go. But I can't expect too much of them. I mean, I don't think that they particularly enjoyed having to deal with me. I think I was probably an annoyance.
Unfortunately, I think this is the India we all know and love. And okay, so we spoke about how passionate you all are about the work you do. I have to ask, why don't you just tell us what you hate most about the job? The thing that makes you want to throw your hands up in despair and run screaming into the night, or maybe consider an alternate career in the bomb squad, something like that. What's the thing that you really hate about what you do?
Copy editors telling you you've got the punctuation wrong.
Oh, really? I love them.
No, I
man.
hate them. I
Really?
hate them.
If you find a typo in my book, come, tell me. I have a part of my webpage where I mark all the typos. So I love copy editors.
What about you, Diana? What's the...
I think what I find frustrating sometimes is when you sense that there's something to be found. You were talking about the search for a document. You feel that something that has really intrigued you and is bothering you could be answered if you could only find something which you're sure is there to be found. But you go through, you spend days and days sitting in some archive, leafing through stuff, and you start you have the feeling that if just give it one extra day, I maybe will find it. And then in the end, you never do, and you wonder whether you gave up too soon. And it's very frustrating.
So you probably get nightmares about it. And
sometimes, yes, you feel unsatisfied. We did a book about a 17th century Englishman who became a true pirate of the Caribbean and went off around the world, and the books he wrote became huge bestsellers, and he influenced people like Charles Darwin and the geographer Humboldt and things, a hugely influential character. But when we were researching him, although we had all the material that he'd published and we saw his influence on the intellectual world, we could find so little about his personal life, his thoughts and feelings and people he interacted with. Even the fact that we found some evidence that he was a bigamist, but we couldn't take that any further. And I would love to have unpicked that a little bit more. So that kind of thing can be frustrating and make you sometimes just want to sort of throw your notes out of the window and think of something else.
I think for me, and I don't know if you experience this too, but writing and researching is a lonely process. And that was the hardest for me to come to grips with. I mean, of course I have friends, and I'm a very social person.
Friends?
Oh, really? But nonetheless, you're usually by yourself, and maybe you even find that even though you have someone else, there's a certain loneliness that you have in the writing and the researching. I found that to be the most disheartening. There are times where my book took me 6 years to write, five and a half, 6. There were times where I was just like, I'm not going to finish this. I'm done. And the reason wasn't because I didn't doubt myself. It's just I didn't want to live the lifestyle by myself, writing, researching by myself. Yeah. And I think that was probably the hardest for me
Yeah.
to come to grips with.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's easier with the two of us, the loneliness thing, but it still exists. You're still sometimes in your own little capsule. And somebody, I think, made a comment at the inauguration ceremony this morning saying that writers don't really feel self-doubt. And I thought, ooh, I certainly do on many, many occasions. And it's not a comfortable feeling, especially if it lasts a long time. You think you can't find your way out of something.
Okay, and you talked about this, I don't know, this writer who lacks self-doubt or whatever, but I've heard lots of writers say that once they've completed a mammoth project, at the end of it they experience something close to postpartum depression, where you probably feel empty, and you talked about loneliness being an issue. How do you handle that, or have you experienced it, or how do you feel after it's done? You're like, hey, it's party time, or you're like, okay, what do I do with myself now?
Yeah, it is quite hard sometimes, and if Andrew feels the same, to when you reach the end of a project, to let go, and your text is in the hands of others, and it's gone, and it was yours for all that time, and it isn't anymore, and it's shortly going to become public, and what are people going to say and think about it? And that certainly makes me very anxious. I think perhaps Mike rather less so, but I find that an uncomfortable period, and I think we try to distract ourselves by thinking about what the next project is going to be.
Yeah, it's sort of, sometimes could be like a bad relationship you can't leave.
A toxic relationship.
Exactly, and I constantly want to go back, and there are times where I think, I got the interpretation wrong here, but once it's in print, you can't change it.
Okay, so, speaking about the next project, could you perhaps tell us what's in the works?
What we're currently working on is a non-fiction book about Charles Darwin and the voyage of the Beagle. Because I mentioned earlier that we wrote a book about this rather extraordinary pirate of the Caribbean who went on to have this great scientific and literary legacy. And one of the people who was affected by what the pirate wrote was Darwin. And also, on my mother's side, I have some family some relationship to Darwin's family. And we wanted really to understand what that 5-year voyage was like for Darwin as a very young man, a sort of extended gap year, but also what it was like for the other people on board the ship with whom he was interacting. So the focus is going to be very much on the voyage of the Beagle. We're going to try where we can to go in Darwin's footsteps. We're going to Chile, around the coast of South America, and we're going to the Galapagos Islands. And that's going to take us, I think, the next 18 months to 2 years to complete.
Nothing I'm willing to discuss yet. Yeah. I'll keep it a secret.
I think we can open the floor to questions now. If anyone has any questions, please feel free. We have a mic, please. Yeah, okay, fine, but just the people in the last row to hear you.
It's not very often you see people who have worked, one set has worked on Lord Clive, and the other one, while working on Hickey, obviously came across Warren Hastings. So William Dalrymple was here in the city about a month ago, and I had interviewed him, and my headline was that actually it was Robert Clive should have been impeached and not Warren Hastings, because he was a grey character and he did some good work for Bengal. So I would like to have individual comments from all three of you. Clive versus Hastings. Can we have a small debate?
Well, I can't do much on Hastings, but Clive was hauled before Parliament and asked to justify why he'd got so much money in his back pocket. And he was also asked to justify that by the East India Company. So he couldn't be impeached because he wasn't a government official, but he got pretty well kicked over at various times by the British authorities.
I think I can answer this question sort of more of a legal answer. The Regulating Act of 1773 put the East India Company under quasi-parliamentary control, so therefore Hastings would be under the direction of Parliament and the directors of the East India Company in London. So there's oversight, official government oversight, so no longer is it a fully private company, but it's responsible to not only shareholders of the government, and so Hastings' actions should be judged under a different lens, if you want to. I'm not going to differentiate between their characters. I think that's speculation that might be a bit too far from my own research. But I think that's an important distinction to note in how they were treated.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Writing about history is always a tricky job nowadays because what we have been already written and now it has been rewritten. People are they are taking different perspective on the history itself. So it's a big debate that is currently going on in this country as well. So what is your take on the writing or rewriting history from that perspective?
I think the only thing we can say about that is trying to be objective, when you look back at other people's histories, trying to check that they've used all the sources, and trying not as a historian to express your own opinions too often, but rather to try and work out what the actual story was.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're trying to do, whether you're talking about non-fiction or historical fiction, is with the material that you have at your disposal to try so far as you can to get at the truth. And I think it's unfortunate if you set out with some sort of very strong predisposition, preconception of something, because that's going to get in the way of really doing your job properly. So what you almost try to do is to shut out that wider debate that might be going on, because why should it be relevant to what you're trying to do, using the disciplines and things that you have learned in this kind of work?
And since none of us are philosophers, we won't get into what is truth.
I think as a foreigner, there is a certain hesitation I have about writing about Indian history. I think I was sort of fortunate in the subject of my book, being an outsider himself, an Irishman, so I felt I was, like I mentioned earlier, uniquely positioned to write this. And I had the ability to go to all the archives around the world, and I had a perspective, I think, that added value. I got this question, we actually all got this question at a session last time about, someone brought up Edward Said and Orientalism and how Westerners view the East. And I think it's important to be cognizant of historical writings in the past and how Western authors have talked about India. I think, if I can say so myself, I think I was kind of fortunate because I hadn't studied Indian history. In fact, I knew nothing. So I came in sort of more as a blank slate, and I'm hoping that allowed me to sort of try to deal away with preconceptions. That was my goal, at least, and I'll let you to judge whether I achieved it.
Yes, so I had this question that to all of you actually, that when, like, history is something that has happened, as the person there told, and when you write history, you write about history, what are your motivations for writing? For example, nowadays content is really appreciated. Now you're writing something that has been written. What is the focal point? Do you go for some values, some human element? Why do you think this story needs to be told?
That's a question that we're often asked by our publisher. They ask us, has this story been told before? And if we reply yes, they say, what are you going to add to it? And if they say no, what makes you think anybody's going to want to read it? Justify it. It's a good point from that particular.
Any research we do is based upon the research that others have done, right? So my book's the untold story of India's first newspaper. Well, and partially it's true, and I think it's true, but it's also marketing too, right? Others have written about Hickey in different ways, and in ways that I think are not complete. They don't tell the whole story, they're biased, they lack information. So that's why we called it the untold story, and I think that's why the story, my story needed to be told, because it's not only important, but it had not been told in a way that I thought it needed to be told.
And like Yeah, and like I was reading the series The Empire of the Mughals. Like what struck me was that it's so brilliantly done. Like you feel like you're there, that like you're experiencing it. But what's the takeaway? Like I feel that these people glorified in history are humanized again. Yes, and what else? Like some of their weaknesses, some of their strengths, their infirmities throughout. And what is it that we can take away? Or that you could take away when you were writing it?
Well, first of all, thank you for your very kind comments about the books, and we're very glad that you've enjoyed them. I think what drew us into writing this series was because we intrinsically found the stories and the characters so interesting. Perhaps that's always got to be the baseline for when you embark on a big work of historical fiction. And we got increasingly drawn in. We found things that perhaps we hadn't anticipated. Perhaps one thing to say is that you have a project in mind at the beginning, and perhaps what you come out with at the end is very different. Our series was originally going to be a trilogy, and then we realized that was never going to work. It grew and expanded. And one of the things that we took away from it was, I think, just how much we personally enjoyed it. We wrote the series because we ourselves were interested in the characters, and we were fascinated by the stories. We didn't know whether other people would feel the same, but we took a lot away from it personally. It felt very satisfying to us to cover that full sort of narrative arc of the 6 great emperors.
And I think one thing that people often don't realize is the commercial imperatives that are behind many of these books. We've all been lucky, all 4 of us, we've had books published, and that very thing means that somebody's picked them out and said they might be marketable, whereas there are people who've told stories well worth telling whose books haven't been judged to be marketable. You see the process that goes through. Diana and I were absolutely amazed by the amount of time that goes into choosing the cover of a book, whether it's going to be presented spine on or face on, how it's going to appeal, what are the colors at the moment that people want to buy, what designs they want to buy. If you go to any bookshop, over the years you'll see changes. You'll see that there was a period when all books were very pale with photographs on. Then books now have become 2 colors. We mustn't forget there's a whole commercial process behind all of us here, and sometimes stories that are well worth telling don't get through that commercial sieve.
Yeah, we've had stories we would like to have told. We've come across things which to us were really intriguing and interesting, and our agent and our publisher said, no, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing this. And just to give another example of what Mike's saying, one day we just submitted the text of, I think, one of the Mughal novels to our editor, and we got a message saying the editor needs to talk to you urgently, and our hearts sank. We thought, oh no, she hates it. Must be something wrong with the storytelling. She's going to tell us to take it away and start again. And it wasn't that at all. When we rang her up, she said, no, I haven't read it yet. She said, the marketing people want to talk to you about the cover, which was both a relief and also seemed to us the wrong way round.
Thank you.
So if there are any more questions, or, okay.
Ma'am, my question is to Diana ma'am and to Michael sir. Ma'am, when you researched about Robert Clive, like I would like to know exactly what exactly was his psyche that turned him into the person he was. Like, what according to you do you think is the reason behind him being so?
I think it's partly his personality. I think I've said I thought he was manic depressive. He was expelled from numerous schools in Britain as a child for fighting, for stealing from other boys. One thing that may have influenced him too was that when he was about 8, his parents sent him off to live with an aunt and then with his grandmother. So in the modern words, he had a troubled youth. That's one thing. The other thing was that he had this desperate desire to prove himself to be better than other people at things, to show himself to be top dog. He also, I do believe, had this almost compulsive feeling that he needed to be the only one who was in charge. He wasn't good at cooperating with his generals and people, and he fell out with them. That's not a proper answer, but some of the things were in his youth. Some of the things are inherent characteristics. Some of the things, he was very sleepless. He used to take opium to sleep, and you can imagine him having all sorts of thoughts going through the night. But that's not the whole answer, that's just some thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think he did suffer from, we'd probably be able to diagnose it today, a sort of hyperactivity. So he was someone who would flourish when there was a crisis and something to be done, but had no inner resources when in quieter periods, and very self-destructive, as well as destructive to others around him.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, if there are any more questions, or we can wind up. So I'd like to thank my panelists. I think we can all agree they've been absolutely amazing. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to share the stage with them. Can we please have a huge round of applause for them? Thank you very much. And you've been a great audience. Thanks so much.
Thank you.